Hello from New York. Start again. Good morning, everybody. Good morning from New York City. I am Sarah Demy, the founder and CEO of Demy-Colton. And on behalf of the Demy-Colton team, along with our partner for this salon, the Entente Network of Companies, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second installment of the Briefing Room series. The Briefing Room salons equip the C-suite and communications and marketing leaders with what they need to know, what they need to think about, and what they need to act upon at the intersection of science, strategy, and society. Partnered with Entente Network, an innovation-focused communications and marketing advisory firm, we are bringing our two platforms together to reach a bigger global audience. We welcome all of you who are joining us today and for the first time. Sorry, we just got stuck here. Demy-Colton's mission is to convene healthcare industry leaders to advance Sorry, I'm really having a little bit of trouble with this little script here. So Demy-Colton's mission is to convene healthcare industry leaders to advance this sector and to catalyze change. We do this through our in-person events, including our Global Biotech CEO Summit, BioFuture, our executive clinics, and Biotech Showcase, which will be taking place in January in San Francisco alongside the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. More information can be found on our website. A quick housekeeping note, we will start with a 50-minute discussion, then go into a Q&A session. This salon is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing later today on the Demy-Colton YouTube channel, and I'm sure it will also be available on the Entente channel.
Indeed.
So to today's briefing room.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe. As Sarah said, I'm Virginia Ammon, CEO and founder of Entente. We do IR, PR, and precision marketing for health and science organizations. And I want to thank Sarah and her entire team for always being great partners to us. We are co-producing this series to help bring new light into some critical issues that are affecting science and innovation today. Today's topic is near and dear to my heart, and I think it's one that really just couldn't be more urgent with some policy changes and other things that are happening. And I'm hoping that today's discussion with this really esteemed panel will go deeper than just the trust in science conversation. I think that one we've had a lot. What I'd like to do is go to a more foundational, if often overlooked issue of how do we rebuild and strengthen the relationship between science and society so that we can build a stronger ecosystem and really a better world. So I am joined here today by four people who I work with and respect very much. Erin Mertz, who is the head of the Aspen Institute Science and Society program. I'm very privileged to work with Erin as part of the science advisory group there. And I can tell you, Erin does extraordinary work. He can tell you a little bit more about it and what that focus is of that program. Caroline Montojo, who's a neuroscientist by training and is the CEO and president of the Dana Foundation. Rob Ring, who is not only a biotech entrepreneur and a very successful one at that, but also a patient advocate, and Muffy Walker, who is also a patient advocate, but a recent book author in addition to that. If you haven't read her book yet, it is fantastic, and I highly recommend it. So I'm just going to start with Rob, since you're the first one that I see on my Hollywood squares. If you can say a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and what your recent focus has been, and also maybe a little bit about why you're passionate about this issue.
Sure. Thank you, Virginia, and thank you for hosting this morning or this afternoon, wherever you might be watching this today or later on. Yeah, I'm Rob Ring. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Kairos Bioscience. We're just a small biotech that develops medicines for rare genetic syndromes that cause autism and intellectual disabilities. And we just were acquired by Servier, so my tenure as a CEO is ending here within a few weeks, but that's ultimately the goal, is to continue moving the science forward to patients our lead indication was Fragile X syndrome. I'm also a neuroscientist by training and came up the traditional ranks of medicine's development, first at Wyeth. I was worked mostly exclusively in psychiatry. I headed mood and anxiety disorders there, and then moved on to Pfizer, where I had a really unique opportunity to head pharma's first dedicated research unit focusing on the autism spectrum. And even back then, we were looking at the opportunities through the lens of genetic syndromes at that point. I left industry. I've worn a lot of hats. I went from industry to the patient side. I was the chief science officer at Autism Speaks, which is the largest global philanthropy in the working both on the advocacy side, awareness, but also had a very large science portfolio, which I oversaw. So not only did I have a chance to oversee grant making, we started a venture philanthropy arm at that foundation, but did a lot of work on the Hill on the policy side as well. But I'm a drug hunter by training, and that's how I ended up back at Caris, working to develop medicines for an area that I'm quite passionate about. So I think what I bring here is a lot of different hats. I've worked in academia, industry, and on the philanthropy side. So I would call myself multilingual. I think that's oftentimes the challenge we face is really deciphering the language of each of the different parts of the stakeholder ecosystem we work in. So looking forward to the discussion, and I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Rob, so much. This panel, it's by accident. We have a lot of folks who have great neuro background. So, but everybody brings a little bit of a different flavor, different perspective to this conversation. And Rob, we really appreciate the number of hats that you've worn throughout your career, and the perspectives that you can bring here today. I see Muffy on my screen next. So, Muffy, let me ask you to please introduce yourself and tell us why you're passionate about this issue.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Virginia. Yes, my name is Muffy Walker. I am a psychiatric nurse practitioner. I've worked in that field for about 20 years, mostly in the space of PTSD, kind of a strange subsection of that, survivors of multi-generational cult abuse. I founded the International Bipolar Foundation 18 years ago. And then my journey changed a little bit when my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 22 years ago. She unfortunately died 15 years ago, and I just published my first fiction novel. I've published a lot of medical nonfiction, but my first fiction novel called Memory Weavers, and it combines those two spaces. It's about a woman diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's who meets a younger woman who was raped in college and has PTSD. One obviously desperately wants to hold on to her memories while the other wants nothing more but to banish hers. So I'm very, very passionate from a patient advocacy side, not only for people with mental illnesses, but also neuropsychiatric illnesses, Alzheimer's, etc. And I'm very, very happy to be on your panel today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I will link out a link to the Amazon so that folks can pick up your book if they haven't read it already. I see Erin is next on my screen. Erin, can you introduce yourself, please, and tell us why you're passionate about this issue?
Sure. My name is Aaron Mertz. I'm based in New York City. I trained as a physicist and later developmental biologist because I loved discovery for its own sake and how fundamental mathematical laws govern the framework of everything from atoms to human cells to galaxies. Over time, I realized that the scientific questions shaping people's lives were not only technical, they were questions about trust, what is believed, and about whether science feels like something that serves communities rather than something just delivered to them. My laboratory training never prepared me for that tension, but that tension defined how my work landed outside the lab. And that realization pushed me toward nonprofit work. I wanted to understand why the gap between what science can offer and what society can absorb keeps widening, especially in a moment when polarization turns scientific questions into identity tests. The gap is not abstract. It shapes health behavior, climate policy, education, and the decisions young people make about whether they belong in scientific fields. At the nonprofit Aspen Institute, the Science and Society program I founded 6 years ago focuses on that gap. We bring scientists together with community leaders, policymakers, creatives, and young people who rarely speak to one another elsewhere. We create settings where disagreement is expected, where people can talk about scientific questions without immediately sorting into political camps. We work on communication, on incentives, on lived experience of people who feel excluded from scientific institutions.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Some of the work that the Aspen Institute Science and Society group does is convenership. They bring together a number of different people from different places, much like this panel, to talk about these issues. They do research. They also put together some fantastic ways that people can engage with science in a more way that's understandable and relatable. That's just the tip of the iceberg. You do so much, Aaron. I don't know how your level of energy is just beyond. So I thank you for all the contributions that you make to bringing science forward.
I'm thrilled to get to work with you, Virginia.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I'm so happy that we've known each other for so long. Caroline, just the beginning. Caroline, can I ask you, please, to tell us a little bit about yourself and what Dana Foundation is doing and why you're passionate about this issue?
Yes, absolutely, Virginia. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. It's such an honor to be on this panel with Robert, Muffy, and Aaron. And I really appreciate also this focus on message meets meaning, right? How can we better connect science with local communities and people and how it impacts their lives? So as you mentioned, Virginia, I'm Caroline Montojo. I'm president and CEO of the Dana Foundation. My background is in neuroscience. So I was examining, when I was in research, biomarkers for psychiatric illness in a genetic high-risk population. What really drew me into neuroscience was a strong interest in mental health and mental illness and understanding the underlying neural mechanisms that are sort of the basis of different brain conditions. And so that's what drew me into neuroscience. And then I took a somewhat atypical path. I went from research into philanthropy. I was really attracted to being able to help science to best benefit and positively impact the lives of people and communities. And so I found that in the philanthropic sector, for starting at the Cowley Foundation, which is based in California. And there I was director of life sciences and brain initiatives. And I led and facilitated the build of the International Brain Initiative, which was an initiative that brought together the established and developing large-scale brain initiatives in the sort of earlier around 2013, 2014 time period and onward. And it was through that set of initiatives that I became really interested in the intersection of neuroscience and society. When we asked the leaders of all these large-scale brain initiatives, what did they feel they could best collaborate on, they pointed to, well, with all of these exciting discoveries and neurotechnology developments that are coming online, a major area of opportunity to collaborate is thinking about the ethical and societal implications of these developments. And so that's what got me hooked. And then about 5 years ago, I was recruited to come to the Dana Foundation because the Dana Foundation was refining its mission to focus on exactly that intersection. So our mission as of just a few years ago is to advance neuroscience that benefits society and reflects the aspirations of all people. And we carry this out through 3 programmatic pillars focused on education, next generation training, and bidirectional public engagement. So I can share more about that, but just really a pleasure to be here today. And thank you for convening us.
Thank you so much for joining us. One of the things that I have always admired about Caroline is, and it's part, I think, of the Dana's mission as well, that you are so dedicated to bringing people together to solve these challenges and to really, I think, to honor the perspectives, the lived experiences of people from all walks of life. And I think that's I think it's a beautiful mission at the Dana and something that is a personal passion for you as I've gotten to know you over the years that I just admire so much. So thank you so much for joining us today and also for your extraordinary work leading the Dana Foundation. So let me actually turn it over to you with our first question. sort of what is the state right now? How bad has it gotten between this disconnect between science and society, and the relationship between society and science? And why is it important that we solve this?
Yeah, absolutely, Virginia. Thank you for that question. I think that, this is a really profoundly different time for science and its role in society across many different sectors. And as you said, one of the things that really attracted me to focusing on philanthropic work was to better bring together different sectors, different disciplines, especially the viewpoints of people coming from different communities across the country, so that they can participate in and see how science best benefits their lives. And so I think one reflection that I have is thinking about how our science enterprise was sort of formulated in its current concept. And this was all the way back in 1945 with the publication of the Endless Frontier report by Vannevar Bush. And that really, I think, set a model for a social contract between science and society and led to many of the incredible discoveries, innovations, and economic growth and progress that we've seen today. Now, one thing that that report, in many analyses after it, did not intentionally include was thinking about the voices of different communities and how they would participate in the scientific process. Also thinking about accessibility, equity, how would all of the fruits of that discovery disseminate into public sector so it could best serve their lives. And so this is actually where I see, some of the erosion now that we're of the social contract between science and society. And I think it's prompting many of us to recognize that we have an opportunity to envision a new social contract wherein science can best be seen, best be felt, and benefit different sectors of the public in new ways. And so I just, wanted to share that I also think that this is an opportunity, even in the current erosion, to re-envision what that future can look like when it's better integrated with the voices of the people it's meant to serve.
Thank you. Thank you for that thoughtful answer. Rob, can I turn it over to you really from both a patient advocacy, but also a private sector perspective? How broken is this relationship, and why is it important that we fix it?
Well, I recall, I don't know who the author was, but it's often been said that change travels at the speed of trust. And innovation and the ability to translate advances and innovations in science into things that actually matter for patients and people out there who are in need of these innovations requires trust. Trust in the process that generates evidence on which decisions are made. And I think there's a fundamental erosion in this trust between the ultimate beneficiaries of scientific innovation and those who are generating it, and everyone in between that seems to insert more ideological views on these. I think there's a real problem with the trust between these key stakeholders. And without that, it's really hard to see the pace of this moving with the urgency that I think patients desperately want to see happen.
Thank you. Erin, any thoughts on that in terms of pacing? How broken is this relationship? Why is it important that we fix it?
For me, the relationship between science and society matters, quite simply. Discovery cannot move a polarized country forward unless people see themselves in the conversations around science and the trust systems that act on scientific knowledge. When I look across the American landscape, I see a repeated pattern. We have a remarkable research engine that Caroline and I were part of before we moved into our respective work now. Yet the pathways that carry scientific knowledge into civic life are fragmented. Researchers, policymakers, community leaders, and communicators work on timelines and incentives that rarely align. Discovery moves quickly. Policymaking moves slowly. Community life follows lived pressures rather than institutional agendas. Breakthroughs exist, but their relevance to daily life is uneven. A second barrier is cultural fatigue. Many people feel overrun by information and under supported by institutions. In that environment, even careful science communication can register as noise. If someone is dealing with economic strain or health pressures, science doesn't feel clarifying unless the messenger is trusted and the format feels human. And a third barrier is that we often treat the gap as a knowledge transfer problem. In reality, the deeper issue is a weak relationship between institutions and communities. People engage with science when they see scientists and scientific institutions showing up consistently, listening well, and acknowledging uncertainty without defensiveness. My program focuses on building connective tissue. We design structured dialogues, durable partnerships, and narrative frameworks that bring science into civic spaces rather than expecting communities to come to scientific ones. The Aspen Institute's neutral, nonpartisan role helps us convene groups that rarely intersect. That vantage point allows us to build the systems that support integration instead of episodic outreach. The challenge is large, but the opportunities grow when people feel invited rather than overwhelmed.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to dig into what the structural and cultural barriers might be from your perspective. But let me ask Muffy first to weigh in on this issue. How broken is this relationship? Why is this important that we fix it?
Thank you. I don't want to repeat what everybody's already said, but I think we're all on the same wavelength. As an advocate, one of the biggest disconnects I see is that scientific institutions often decide what communities should care about instead of asking communities what they actually care about. Institutions obviously tend to prioritize research questions, metrics, timelines, while communities, as everyone has said, prioritize trust, access, safety, and feeling seen. When institutions talk in terms of protocols and endpoints, communities are talking about stigma, transportation, caretaking burden, or fear of being dismissed. So you feel the gap immediately. Real alignment happens only when institutions start by listening and not assuming.
That's a very interesting reflection. I think Dana Foundation is doing a lot to help advance listening. So I'm sure, Caroline, you may have some perspectives on this one. What kinds of things need to happen to help advance this listening relationship between institutions and the people who benefit from science?
Yeah, thank you, Virginia. And I really appreciate, Muffy, what you just mentioned, because at the Dana Foundation, this is a major focus of our work is being able to develop these bi-directional engagement opportunities and opportunities for listening. One of our values is, we stay grounded. And so also listening with humility, epistemic humility, to understand that everybody comes to the table with their own set of lived experience. And that is those are views that should be integrated into the scientific process. And so just to share a little bit about what we do at the Dana Foundation, one of the areas that we focus on is developing new models for bidirectional public engagement. So this is being able to ask communities how neuroscience can positively impact their lives, inviting them to share the types of questions, the types of values they think could be integrated into the research process. And this builds on a few decades of work that the foundation has also supported as a sort of foundational role in outreach and education through initiatives like Brain Awareness Week. And one concrete example of this is something called the Implantable Brain-Computer Interface Collaborative Community. This is led by one of the leading researchers in implantable brain-computer interfaces to help people who have difficulties with speaking due to paralysis or even with movement. And so it's also co-led by a patient advocate, Jennifer French, who herself also has a brain implant. And so this is an FDA recognized effort that brings together a very diverse set of stakeholders. It's researchers, it's clinicians, companies, regulators, ethicists, and people with brain implants to tackle the ethical and practical challenges collaboratively. And by interfacing directly with patients, this group was able to develop the first set of clinical outcome measures for implantable brain-computer interface use cases. And this helps to ensure that technologies are not only evaluated and judged on safety metrics, but also on whether they improve the things that patients identify matters to their lives.
Interesting. And Rob, I want to take that back to you for a minute. The R&D community has, I think, historically chased science. I've been in biotech, biopharma innovation now for close to 30 years. And I think that we chase the science. I think we also chase somewhat the unmet need among patients, but is lived experience enough of a part of the equation as bioscience researchers are thinking about, in the private sector in particular, thinking about bringing forward innovation?
Well, I think, at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves what's the goal of what we're trying to achieve through science and scientific innovation. And certainly in the fields that we've shared in the past, in the biotech, biopharma world, that's turning science into things that matter for patients. And it seems absurd that you would embark on a process to do that without having the North Star of that being the patient's voice. I'm often amused at some of the challenges large pharma has made trying to adapt to rare diseases that they may not know really anything about before getting into them. Maybe there's a scientific innovation that's brought them to this rare disease. And they oftentimes come and say, hey, we always have a seat at the table for patients, and it's just the wrong orientation. It's their table. And we are serving that table, and I think there's really that bidirectionality that has been already discussed is really absolutely critical, is to everybody's a partner in this process. But at the end of the day, who is the customer of what we're doing? Who is the beneficiary of what we're doing? And if they don't have if they're not at the head of the table, then I think we really have to question what it is we're trying to achieve. The processes that we improve this, there's not going to be one right solution for it. Every patient community has different needs. They're evolving. Science is evolving quickly to open doors to new innovations that can benefit them. I just think there needs to be better forums for us to dynamically have these bidirectional, it's not even bidirectional, just multi-directional conversations, because it's not just patients and drug makers. There is an entire value chain of people involved in doing this. They oftentimes speak, different languages, as I mentioned. And as Aaron said, there really is a misalignment of incentives and understanding on how you do that. Creating better alignment, I think, ensures that we're all on the same boat, so to speak.
Thank you. Yeah, in addition to the misalignment and incentives, Aaron, are there other cultural or structural barriers that are preventing this sort of meaningful integration of science into society and creating that paradigm where people are helping to determine directionally where science moves to?
I think one of the major issues is that there are so few forums in which scientists and non-scientists can actually interact. There's some data from the Research America and Pew Research. 72% of Americans as of 2021 could not name a living scientist. And more than half people said that they could not name a medical or health research institution. All they would have to name is their local community college, their state school. People don't make that connection that is one place where research actually takes place. One idea I heard from one of my advisors, Lee McIntyre, he thought that one thing scientists should do, instead of just trying to get on CNN and big media platforms, they should go to local grocery stores and hand out business cards saying, I'm a scientist, here's what I do, and here's why it matters. Because there's so few opportunities for people to interact with scientists. They're just this mystery. When I moved to New York, I was coming from major university cities where it was very common for people to know graduate students, doctoral students, what that meant. In New York, for several months outside where I was at Rockefeller University, I would meet people who said they never knew that New York had scientists. So I think that would be one of the major structural things to change, is that we should be more integrated into the societal framework.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Why is this not? I mean, it's the public trusting science, being engaged in science is critical to the future of all scientific enterprise, whether that be in academia or in the private sector. I mean, why have we not done more earlier? What is preventing that? Rob, I would particularly be interested in your point of view on this from private sector, but also Caroline looking at academia. Why has more not been done? Dana Foundation and Aspen Institute and others and the patient advocacy work, I think, is helping to solve some of this problem. But I think as a science sector, we have not done enough early enough to engage people to invest in this problem. Why is that? Bob, can I take that one to you? Or have we done enough?
Sorry, that one's to me.
Yeah, please.
Wow, I don't have an answer to that,
Okay.
and
It's a big question.
I think there's a certain myopia in terms of the energy and resources that are committed to solving problems like this, say in industry, that are more narrowly focused on whatever needs to be accomplished for that particular program or the strategy of that company, rather than, seeing there's a lot of pre-competitive space for everyone to work in to make the ground more fertile for new innovations to come forward in relationships with patient communities. I don't think industry is going to take that on by themselves, but I think they can be led into participating meaningfully in that. But I think it's really going to have to come from outside that industry, from from a non-competitive space. And it sounds like, the foundations that are represented here, Autism Speaks, when I worked for that's exactly what we were trying to do. We were trying to improve our community's ability to consume scientific information, make good decisions about that, dispel misinformation. We're not going to take on programs to teach critical thinking and the ability to understand where information's coming from. We carried that burden for much of the community. But unless you get down to the fundamental, primary and secondary education of our entire country, that's where it has to start, is
Mm,
put value on this as a field and start teaching kids how to think critically about the information they're consuming. We have a problem about the volume of information coming at individuals. It's the same old problem back to snake oil days in the 1800s. We still have the same issues, but the amount of information individuals are going to have to navigate is just simply overwhelming at this
mhm.
point, and it's overwhelmed their ability to actually properly consume it, I think.
Mm. Yeah, and you talked earlier about sort of flipping this paradigm. So instead of the industry sort of setting the table and inviting people to it, it's really the public's table. Caroline, you're doing some really extraordinary work, I think, to help sort of empower the public to set that table and to invite people in. Can you talk a little bit about some of those programs and how are those working?
Yeah. Thank you, Virginia. I think that this, this area that you're raising is such an important one, and I do think that a lot of the fundamentals of this kind of are systematic and tie back to the incentive structure established through this, Endless Frontier Vannevar Bush support report. And I think there are a couple of things that strike me that also relate to Dana programs. I think one of them is in the area of scientific training. And so for decades, training systems were really designed to produce university professors, people who would continue to stay in academia. But one of the things that we're noticing is that today's emerging scientists are pursuing careers in many different sectors: industry, communications, policy, law, education, even beyond that. And so, if we want to be able to prepare this next generation of scientists to navigate a world where neuroscience intersects with everyday life, then early training will need to include other areas that are not typically included. At least were not included in my own area when I was trained. These include communication skills, ethical reasoning, understanding of societal and historical contexts in which science sits, also understanding the context for community engagement and why that matters. So I think that this will require a change in incentive structure. So that's one area. I'll also say that another area that we focus on that Robert just referred to is in the area of education. As we started doing some landscaping work to develop our strategy here at the foundation, one of the areas of feedback that we received from many grantees is that you can actually start introducing these conversations around the ethical and societal implications of neuroscience science in middle school, in high school. This
Mm.
is students are starting to develop their worldview of science and how it fits into their lives. So even conversations around implantable brain-computer interfaces, thinking about the role of biological enhancement, all of these areas, middle schoolers, high schoolers have thoughts, views, perspectives about these. And so what we've been doing is funding new models for neuroscience education that include ethical reflection, critical thinking, the history of neuroscience, so that they can have a more holistic understanding. But what's really interesting about this is those types of holistic models for training actually help these young students to see scientists as more than just a dry subject matter. They can see how it matters for their lives and their communities. So in that sense, the early data that we're getting from these models is that students are developing a stronger STEM identity, an identity of themselves as scientists or participants in science.
Beautiful. And Muffy, I think the work that you're doing, Erin's talking about scientists literally going out into public spaces and introducing themselves. Caroline, you create the infrastructure that enables people to come together and to actually experience science even from an early age. Muffy, I love what you're doing, and that you're creating a sort of a story around science that helps people to recognize themselves and the challenges that they face, and perhaps that their family members face, as being more, broader than themselves, as being a bigger issue than themselves. Talk about what the inspiration for your book was, and some of the talks and other things that you're doing around that to help engage people.
Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and at the time, there was very little information or help, support lines available. And my husband's an MD, PhD, and I'm a nurse practitioner, and still we were kind of floundering. So worked our way through that, and then his mother got Alzheimer's disease. She's fortunately still alive. And I felt through writing my book, Memory Weavers, that I could impart scientifically spot on information to the reader in I don't want to call it in an entertainment way, but for lack of a better word, in a way to entertain while educating through the book. So all of the information throughout the book about Alzheimer's, about their medications and lifestyle, etc., is all correct information. So the person can finish the book and not only have enjoyed a piece of fiction, but also learned quite a bit about Alzheimer's, about the role of the caregivers, about the heritable aspect with her particular disease, and also with the woman with PTSD. At the end of the book, I have a 2 or 3 page resource section where I list all kinds of organizations and hotlines, etc., where people can get even more information if they want to. So that was a very important piece for me when I was writing the book, was it not just to have it be a fiction novel, but for it to actually impart education and information that was scientifically correct.
Thank you. And you've done more than write the book. You also are hosting book clubs and doing other kinds of things to get to create dialogue and conversation around the book. How is that going?
The book part is the actual book part is going very slowly. I did do book talks around the country. I was at Penn and some biotech companies in New York and here in San Diego. But it's kind of sad to learn this, but if you're not picked up by Oprah, Jenna, or Reese, you're really not going to go anywhere in terms of your book. There's 1,000 books out every week. But what has grown from that is because of my patient advocacy and my knowledge about Alzheimer's, I've been invited to join the board of the Global Brain Trust. They're actually all in San Diego now for this big Alzheimer's meeting that's taking place on clinical trials. And from that person, then from being on the Brain Trust, then I was invited to chair an event for the Us Against Alzheimer's organization. So we've brought in Dr. Eric Topol, who of course just wrote the book Super Agers. And we have Emma Willis, Bruce Willis's wife, coming to speak, along with Mary Lou Falcone, who's a internationally acclaimed music strategist whose husband had Lewy body. So we're kind of covering the major dementias in the various talks. And so I don't know what the next step will be, but it just keeps growing and growing. And I'm really happy to be in this space as a patient advocate and bring this information to people.
Thank you. Yeah, it looks like an extraordinary event. I look forward to being there next month with you. So Erin and maybe Caroline, I mean, there's some infrastructure challenges, I think, with public education, especially with the pace of science moving forward as quickly as it does. How are we solving those? Both of you are working on different kinds of programs to help solve that. What more needs to happen? Caroline, maybe I'll toss that one to you to start with.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, Virginia. And I was also reflecting on Robert's earlier comment about trust and then Erin's comment about trusted messengers. And so in the realm of education, I had talked a little bit about the middle school, high school area and undergrad, but I think we think about public communication through nodes. So who are these trusted messengers? Who people turn to for science information? And do those sources feel trustworthy and relevant to them? And so we conducted, in partnership with Research America, a survey to understand how Americans feel and perceive brain health and brain health issues. And what was really interesting, there were a lot of interesting findings from that study. One of them was that when we asked the question about, who do you believe are the most trusted sources of brain health information in your lives? It was doctors and nurses, these medical professionals, right? And so, but at the same time, so that was already a really interesting piece of information. At the same time, we recognize that there is a knowledge gap as well. Many primary care providers haven't necessarily had updated training in neuroscience, even if they're caring for patients with neurological or psychological conditions every day. And so what we did after that was, Muffy had mentioned Us Against Alzheimer's. We actually provided a grant to Us Against Alzheimer's for their Brain Health Academy, which it provides continuing medical education for primary care professionals so that they can understand what the state of neuroscience is, and they can be better informed to also inform their own patients. So I think, the benefits of these kinds of efforts are really twofold. One, it strengthens practitioner knowledge, but then secondly, it also makes neuroscience relevant to the lived health experiences of people. We also funded a second grant to Marshall University that focuses on providing neuroscience education to mental health providers. I think we need to be thinking about the nodes, these gateways for communication. Who are the trusted messengers for this? I also love how Erin mentioned scientists going to the local grocery store and talking about this, because I think that sometimes we forget that scientists are part of society. Scientists are part of the public, and science is a societal activity. So I just wanted to highlight that too.
Thank you. Yes, it was extraordinary to me in working in corporate communications, especially with Big Pharma for so many years. The research that we conducted showed that lay people who are using products and innovation that come out of the industry understand science in part through sort of a profit motive. And certainly I think that needs to be there for innovation to continue to move forward. But the scientists that I know they're regular people. They're people who are very passionate about making life better, about making the world better, who are very curious about science and bringing science forward. And I'm not sure that we always just bring the everyday people who are working within the industry, within academia. We don't highlight their stories enough. We talk a lot about the science itself, but not about the people who are passionate about bringing it forward. And I do think as a communicator, that is one way that we could help to solve some of this challenge. Erin, some of the work that you all are doing is about highlighting the stories of science. Can you talk about some of those and what can we all be doing better to sort of help create an ecosystem that's sharing those stories more widely?
Think a lot about storytelling. For the past few years, I've been creating a feature-length documentary called The Endless Frontier, referencing Vannevar Bush's report from 1945. We just finished it and are now planning distribution and an impact campaign for next year. The film aims to show how science actually functions,
Mm.
not only the breakthroughs, but the long timelines, the uncertainty, the teamwork, the grant writing, and the motivations that sustain scientists when progress is slow. Viewers meet researchers across biomedical fields as well as the patients who rely on their work. That combination makes the stakes clear, yet the focus remains on the process behind the eventual advances, the questioning, the trial and error, the way scientific ideas weave through institutions and communities before they become treatments or technologies. Creativity helps reveal that reality without distorting it. When film stays grounded in real people and real practice, it gives the public a clearer sense of how science works and why society depends on research that requires patience, curiosity, and long horizons. So I would answer your creativity question that way.
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting. I think one of the challenges, particularly in the COVID response, was that there was a lack of understanding amongst the public that there is uncertainty is part of the scientific process. We don't, as certain as we sound, and as promising as it sounds that science is going to give us definitive answers. In fact, it's an iterative process. I'm not sure that that's fully well understood. And I think that the work that we do as patient advocates maybe can help educate people along those lines. But I think there's a lot more that could happen on that front.
Can I just say one thing about that topic,
please,
Virginia?
Please, yeah.
I've spoken about this publicly before, but one of the biggest failings I think in the pandemic was you may remember that the initial mask guideline was wear a mask if you're symptomatic. Then suddenly the guideline changed to wear a mask at all times. That was presented or interpreted as a scientific flip-flop. People didn't know what was going on, but actually that change should have been celebrated, that science and its policy recommendations were responding to new data. Initial data did not show that there was asymptomatic transition. Then asymptomatic transmission was shown, so the policy recommendation changed. That should be celebrated because that was science actually working instead of flip-flopping, as I think a lot of the media presented that change to be.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting insight, and I might add to that. In addition to science being iterative, we should be celebrating that process. Failure is part of that iterative process. Failing and not getting to the answer is part of figuring out how to get to the answer. And I'm not sure that we always communicate about that well either. Are there other misunderstandings, I think, that break down trust, where we could actually educate about failure, about the iterative processes? What other kinds of things can we be educating public around that would help to advance understanding at a foundational level so that there's not confusion when these things do happen? I'll throw that out to any of you. Aaron, you look like you have thoughts.
I know. One thing I would love to, I mean, this is a big dream. One thing I would love to see change is how science is taught very early on. It's taught as a textbook with closed covers, as a homework assignment or examination with an answer key. That's actually not what science is. It's not a finite collection of already agreed on facts, but actually it's an iterative process that is constantly evolving. And I think people need to understand that that's what science is. And then they would develop their own curiosity about it, know that they can contribute instead of thinking, well, the textbook is already written, this field is done. It's actually a work in progress that will never be complete. And that's one of the most beautiful things about it.
Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. Any other thoughts on areas that we can perhaps collectively in academia, at the foundation level, think tanks, patient advocates, the private sector work together to help bring better understanding and clarity to the public around?
Yeah, Virginia. Oh, I'm sorry, Robert. Go ahead. I think you were going to. Yeah, go ahead.
Rob?
No, I wasn't going to say anything. Go right ahead.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Caroline. Thank you.
Well, I was thinking about your question, Virginia, and reflecting on what Aaron just shared. One of the other, I think, models to help establish deeper relationships, deeper understanding, but also meaningful participation and engagement comes from one of the grantees that we've been funding through our Dana Center Initiative for Neuroscience and Society. So I'll just tell this like brief story about the demonstration project that the University of California, Los Angeles, and its partner university, Charles R. Drew University, conducted in order to help actually bring community into the scientific process. And so, this is almost like a deeper level going from education about this is how science works to you can actually participate in it yourself. And so what they did was they convened a collab with members of the South Central LA community to understand how they saw neuroscience playing a role in their lives and how it could positively impact their lives. And one of the things that they pointed to was that they were concerned about the presence of low-flying helicopter noise in the LA area. I actually used to live in LA, so now I realize, oh my goodness, this actually happens to be have the most low-flying helicopter flybys of any area of the U.S., which is such an interesting sort of realization. But what they then did is they took that basic science research question into the labs at UCLA and Charles Drew and tested what are the effects of this type of helicopter noise in different animal models, rodents, fruit flies. They did find that there were effects in brain activity in these various animal models, but they didn't stop there. They actually then gave that data back to community members in South Central LA, and they took this to City Hall as the council members were deciding on whether to purchase more helicopters for surveillance. And with that data in hand, they decided to pause on that question to collect more data to make sure they were going to be focusing on the best policy aspect that could benefit their community. So I just wanted to add in that other flavor of engagement. It's a different model of and a deeper model of education in that they could actually also be the source. Communities can also be the source of inspiration for experimental questions.
It's really interesting. Both science became an instrument for policy education, but also for engagement. I commend the Dana Foundation for thinking creatively about how to tackle some of these issues. I'm realizing I feel like we could talk about this challenge all day. I want to move to the other types of solutions like that one that could be interesting. And I want to end on a positive note before we move into the Q&A session that Sarah Demy will help to moderate from the public questions that have come in during the session. But if you could imagine, I'm going to throw this out to Annie and all of you, a future where public engagement with science is truly thriving. What does that look like? And what would be happening differently than is happening today? So Erin, maybe I will start with you and Muffy. If you can think about this issue, and Muffy, I'm really curious, especially since you've been getting feedback from publics during some of these book engagements that you've been doing, what this future could look like or should look like.
I'm going to let Erin go first so I can think about the answer to that.
Sounds good.
So one way to think about that is growing recognition that science needs to be built with communities rather than delivered to them. I see more scientists willing to engage early, acknowledge uncertainty, and treat trust as something earned. And they'll engage more often with public science communication and outreach in addition to their laboratory work. Back when I was a graduate student, young scientists like me who were interested in these endeavors were very quiet about it for fear of backlash from their advisors, from the field. But now I see younger scientists and trainees very vocal about how they want to engage with the public in addition to doing great laboratory research. So I'm really excited to see that shift from when I was a trainee not too long ago, that people are now seeing that their work matters in the lab and also with the public.
Thank you. Yeah, there's some extraordinary training opportunities, I think, for scientists. From our work, I can tell you scientists are sometimes better at doing science than they are talking about science. So, and I'm sure Rob can relate to this and coming through from the R&D side. There's sometimes I think also an unwillingness to sort of take science and make it relatable and understandable from people who don't have a scientific background, because scientists don't want to muddy up what they're saying or say something that's not exactly accurate. And I think that can sometimes be a barrier. But Rob, what would a future look like for you where public engagement with science is truly thriving?
Well, yeah, I'm a believer in both carrots and sticks in some regard. I think there's a lot of incentives to work on the positive side to improve this, but there's not a lot that de-incentivizes individuals from damaging this trust relationship. There are very few liabilities, beyond, having grants, pulled, papers retracted, but in the community of discussion that's happening around science with individuals who are not tenured professors, do not rely on grants. There's very little liability or for disseminating inaccurate information or damaging these relationships. I'm not advocating in this regard to have some sort of form of regulation over this, but there really are no consequences that are in play that I see for the damaging aspects of what are happening in this trust relationship. I don't know what form that would take, but I think this would also improve the trust individuals have with the community of science out there if there was consequences for not adhering to fundamental principles, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember launching the Yoda project with Johnson and Johnson many years ago, which was really about making clinical data, including trial failures, available to the public in a more transparent way, and with a third party that was actually evaluating the requests for that information. Yale serving as that third party, which was an interesting sort of infrastructure, sort of way of approaching building trust and transparency. But there's not a lot like that, I think, in certainly none of it's mandated, and possibly could be. Any thoughts on what kinds of things could or should be in place that would help, or maybe not regulation, but even standards amongst the industry that could help with that?
If that question's for me, I could, take from the existing palette of solutions we have. I mean, just clearing conflicts of interest, requiring transparency around what's motivating people to take positions on certain scientific concepts. But I don't know if there's a path to creating some sort of liability for doing damage, that is really negligent in its nature rather than careless. There's certainly lots of errors. There's lots of careless practice of science, but there is negligent, presentation of data that happens all the time that have real world consequences for patients. And just think about the Women's Health Initiative and the damage that was done, reporting and giving credence to a risk between hormone replacement therapy and breast cancer has done damage over decades. And that wasn't even data that any scientist would get behind, and there were motivations, but there was no liability for that. I don't know what the liability would be, and I don't want to start dragging scientists out, but I just think there needs to be an open discussion about the liability for doing it, for malpractice of science, if you will. There's
Thank
lots
you.
of malpractice in medicine, but not malpractice in science.
And Virginia, if I can just add in, the questions, the majority of them all are about the public perception of science as it's been depicted in the media and storytelling and movies, online, and how it's been depicted negatively. What do we do as a sector to overcome that? That's pretty challenging. And Virginia, to your point earlier, and I think perhaps, Aaron, you mentioned this as well. Science was an ivory tower. They did not, go outside of the ivory tower. I'm just thinking in particular here in New York City, that the academic institutions where they were conducting the research, thinking about doing anything commercial for a long period of time was something that nobody wanted to talk about because they thought it would taint their science. That's a really important attitude that's taken a long time to overcome or to make some breakthroughs in. So when I forget who it was that said that nobody knew that the Rockefeller was here in New York City. They were one of the first ones to welcome, people, CEOs to their facility, but they're the last one to be out there in the public. They're hidden over there on the east side of Manhattan. Um, how do you
Little island
explain
on
that?
the island, as we said when I was over there.
Yeah, no, and it's a great institution.
Yeah. Oh, more
But
Nobel laureates per faculty than any other place. It's fantastic, but no one knows about it.
absolutely. Absolutely. They're a great institution, but they're not out there in the public. And then you have layered on top of everything, the distrust that's been seeded, if you will, by various political administrations. Thinking about COVID, it really damages the reputation. And it's even further. One of the other questions is how is the depiction of science, biotech, and genetic engineering in popular entertainment? How has that affected us? Another one is how do we deal with the deep distrust created by the misuse of medical studies that have historically victimized certain people? Thinking about the Tuskegee experiment, thinking about Henrietta Lack's immortal cell line. How do we deal with that?
Any thoughts on that from any of our panelists?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts, Sarah. I think that those are all questions that are so relevant to this discussion. If I could just make a couple of comments related to them, I think one of them is, to your point about how is science perceived and how is it depicted in the media. I think another important area for the science ecosystem, all of the stakeholders in the research and innovation ecosystem can be thinking about is also the role of social media, YouTubers, influencers, right? Because I think that, media and communication pathways are changing so much. And if one of the aims is to be able to meet people where they are, many people, especially young people, my son included, who's 11 years old, are gravitating toward these like sort of online platforms. And I think there is also an opportunity there. There's quite a bit, as you had pointed out, the sort of forces of misinformation and disinformation. I think there's also an opportunity with some of these influencers who come from science backgrounds or have science interests to be able to sort of utilize their platforms for sharing about scientific information responsibly and accurately. So I just wanted to make that point about different modes of communication. And then to your point about, thinking about ways that scientific information and the research process has also been sort of utilized in a way that disadvantages or even harms communities. I'll just give a recent example of an effort that we're supporting in an area, in a research model called neural organoids. These are 3D models to study brain development and disease. And it's really, a new type of model, but it also carries with it similar types of ethical and societal questions that were prompted by, early stem cell research. And so to the point about making spaces for this, we actually provided a grant for an Asilomar conference in California to bring together researchers, ethicists, science journalists, as well as patients and patient advocates to be able to come together to understand how are these models beneficial? How can they be used to most benefit our lives while still having safeguards around ways that they could potentially be misused? So I think that this comes back to this space of really having that multi-directional engagement that, Rob had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, to your point, and I've just texted somebody to see if I could get the name of the company. There was a diabetes company, a company that was focused on developing a replacement for the pancreas. And they actually brought in a film crew to watch, to basically capture their team's reaction every step of the way as they were going through the process. And it's almost better than one of these thriller movies that you might see, because everybody was really quite concerned about the outcomes. Ultimately, it did not work. And so you capture the failure as well that this particular company went through. But that's, I think, the only case. Virginia, you may know of others that I know of where you got into a biotech company and you got to see how the whole team was engaged in getting to a better outcome, and the severe level of disappointment, if you will, when it failed. I mean, you can buy into a story such as that.
I think it's an important story that we need to tell. I also think that there is an opportunity to tell the stories of the actual process so that people understand how difficult it really is to discover, to make new discoveries in the lab, to bring those to the public. I think it was Caroline mentioned bringing together journalists as part of the Asilomar conference and in conversation around neural organoids, which I know there's a lot of ethical concern around that issue. And there's a lot of curiosity. It's almost sci-fi when you think about that type of science as being a reality today. What role, I did have a question from a journalist come in earlier, what better role, or how can journalists and the media play a stronger role in helping to tell some of these stories, especially from, a patient perspective? And Muffy, this is one I'd like to take to you.
How journalists
Can journalists work better with patient advocates, or what can they do better to help advance the conversation and build trust?
Yeah, I think that's a really good avenue to go down. I've become involved with several journalists through my book, and in fact, I'm going to be interviewed on ABC next week. So
Amazing.
this person that I met at an Alzheimer's meeting worked for ABC, so I sent him my book, and then he read it and he said, "Oh, come on in and we'll have an interview." But I don't know that that happens very frequently, unfortunately.
Mm.
So. Yeah, I definitely the more press we can get out there, the better, but I don't know that it's going to happen that frequently. I was, if I can just go back to one other quick question before you asked about the how we can make scientists um, more visible in the world. So two things I wanted to comment about that. The first is that there is a meeting that takes place every year in Los Angeles called the Breakthrough Prize. It's really like the Oscars of scientific work, but I think it's one of very few that occur. And if you ask my grandson, who's a famous person, he'll probably tell you somebody who's on the Padres. But as was mentioned earlier, nobody will mention that scientist. My husband was noted as the #1 scientist in the world for a decade, and there
Wow.
was no press around that.
Your husband being John Reed over at Johnson and Johnson, heading up R&D over there.
Yes,
Yeah,
there
yeah.
was no mention of that, no article in the local newspaper, nothing. So it really needs to be, these are the people who, not that the Padres baseball player isn't important, but these are the people who are going to be pushing the world forward.
These are the real heroes. Although I got to tell you, that World Series was the most exciting baseball I think I've seen in in a decade. But the scientists are real heroes in our lives that are bringing something meaningful to the table. Not that entertainment isn't, but I think the ability to fight cancer or solve for Alzheimer's diseases would be a lot more meaningful in most of our lives. Rob, it looked like you might have a thought that you wanted to add here before we close out.
No, no, I didn't. Sorry, sorry.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I saw you come off mute. Sarah, Demi, any other questions from our audience today?
I think that's it. I mean, we've covered everything because so many of the questions were pretty identical. So I think this is a wrap, everybody.
Wonderful.
Really interesting topic, and certainly I don't think we've solved the problem, but talking about it will help us get to solving the problem. So I do want to say for our audience, that's all we have today. As I mentioned earlier, the recording of this conversation will be on our website later today, and Virginia will also provide it to you to post on your website. And we'd like to thank you all for joining us and to remind you that next week we will have another virtual salon, this one targeted at companies that will be presenting at Biotech Showcase and how to do a really great job as a presenter. With that said, I want to thank you all. Goodbye now.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Have a great day.
Have a good day.